Establishing connection to Science Night. Please stand by.
Welcome back to the Science Night Podcast. I am James, and with me, as always, is Steffi.
Hey.
And Jason.
Hello.
Tonight, we're talking about terrific turbines, wonderful worms, and ancient asteroids. In the second half, we have my conversation with Camryn Martin, the host of the Nature is Gay podcast. But first, the news. Dear listeners, I have a lot of controversial opinions. I think baseball games are better on radio. I think Syncopation is the best baby metal song. And the Brendan Fraser Mummy movies are criminally underrated. One thing I think we can all agree on is that as a species, we need to figure out a way to generate electricity without all these dang fossil fuels. There are lots of ways to achieve this, and as Steffi will tell you, we shouldn't rule any of them out, especially fusion. However, efforts to harvest the energy potential of ocean currents have largely been absent from this conversation, but that could be about to change. A team from IHI Industries, whose corporate slogan is Hi IHI, has just completed a 3.5-year field test of their 300-ton prototype ocean turbine off the coast of southwestern Japan. There's still a long way to go with this, but the early results are promising in what could be an important addition to future energy production efforts. So what do we think about these terrific turbines just spinning around down on the ocean floor? I also love that they called this turbine the Kaiju, which is kind of close to kaiju. I know they weren't going for that. They were just calling it ocean currents in Japan, but the popular reporting has picked up on that similarity in sound.
It's pretty cool. What is kaiju, actually? I don't even know what that is.
Yeah,
You don't know what kaiju?
No.
Oh, it's like a Godzilla.
Oh.
It's a monster.
That makes sense.
Gotcha.
It's a big monster, comes from the sea.
I mean, this is basically what sounds like they're trying to do. Suspend this big monster of a turbine in the ocean to harness the energy of the currents.
And one of the things I was kind of struck by is the 330-ton turbine they just used was like the baby version, right?
Yeah.
Right.
This was the field test.
Right. It's like, if this works, we're going to make it bigger because the amount of energy that it generates is woefully inadequate at this point, right?
Yes.
But I think that could change.
Yeah, so right now, the prototype that they have, it's only churning out 100 kilowatts of power. It's roughly equivalent to 100 household microwaves. That's kind of how I use my energy equivalent.
No, it's good.
In microwave ovens. Yeah. So they're looking at scaling up this demo with maybe 20-meter long turbines to generate 2 megawatts. But this is just proof of principle right now.
Japan has a lot of coastline, which this article points out. I didn't know if you knew, but according to this article, Japan has a lot of coastline. And it has challenging terrain that makes other renewables pretty hard to do. So they can just kind of like fill the ocean currents with these turbines, and they estimate that if all of this works, they could generate up to the amount that they are currently generating with the combination of nuclear power plants and fossil fuels.
I love how this article talks about how the Japanese public has kind of soured on nuclear power.
I wonder why.
Right. After meltdowns, right? I mean, I get it. I understand. I think what's exciting, though, is that they're going to potentially unleash a tidal wave of tidal power if this comes to fruition. And that's pretty cool. I just cannot put my mind around why we haven't explored this much. I mean, we've already talked about water-powered energy for a long time, right? I mean, mills exist, and they have for a very long time. Hydroelectric dams are part of our energy infrastructure in this country. So why haven't we spent the time trying to figure this problem out the way that we have other problems?
If we're taking a U.S. perspective, right, we have a lot of cheap energy that relatively cheap, if you burning things that's readily available. So you go to that first. If you want to develop a new form of energy, something that's cleaner and better for the environment, it takes investment. That has historically, at least at the foundation level, has been by the government. And there's so many other investments that they're doing in science, and it takes a long time if you're just relying on the government. But we have so much land in the U.S. that you can use for solar energy and wind. That's why we haven't invested it. That's why I like how Japan's looking at, hey, we can't just use what everyone else is using. Mm-hmm. What do we have that's unique to our country and available that we can really tap into? And so I think this is a very interesting approach. The one thing that I was a little bit concerned about, and maybe just because I read this article and I didn't go into it deeper, is there's no talk about the ethical or the implications on how it may impact ocean life.
I can't imagine it would be a positive addition to the ecosystem if we have 20-meter turbines churning up water and kind of messing with the whatever sensory things that the fish are using, that's whales and dolphins. Like, I see a lot of downside to that part of it.
Well, I think any energy source that you're going to use, there's going to be risks. It's going to cause harm, right? And so it's characterizing that and understanding the impact and trying to minimize as much as you can. So I think because this is at the developmental stage, maybe they'll look into that further. I guess we were talking a little bit about why this hasn't been done before. Part of it is also materials. Advanced materials that you can have to withstand these ocean environments, and better understanding of a marine environment will actually aid in the development of this as well.
Right. So I think the concern here is multiple folded, right? I mean, we've got the issue of what the local environment is going to, how the local environment is going to respond to the constant churning of water. But if this generates any sound whatsoever, that's going to travel much further from the specific location. And that could have long-lasting implications for marine life at a much greater distance from the source. And so that's potential. And if you start to scale this up and you put in multiple turbines and they're longer turbines, how does that additive effect sort of manifest downstream? And that could be potentially detrimental as well. So Steffi's point is absolutely right. I mean, the environmental impact is important to understand, but it's also important to understand it relative to the environmental impact that we already are undergoing based on the fossil fuel industry. And so having to choose between which environment to save or which environment to minimize the damage in is an ethical question that's hard to answer. And I'm glad it's way above my pay grade. Not your pay grade, Steffi.
Well, that's why scientists should work with other subject matter experts, right? It shouldn't just be scientists doing this.
No, that's actually a really good point, Steffi, is that one of the biggest arguments that resonates with me, and I am not a libertarian by any stretch, but libertarians actually have a very important contribution to make to the climate change discussion, and that is you can't make decisions based on hard science alone. You have to make decisions about policy based on the combination of hard science and social science. How is this going to affect the people? How is this going to affect communities? Not just environment. And so your point is really well taken.
I don't have anything else productive to add to that. You've all made very excellent points.
I just wanted to see a video of this thing in operation.
I know.
It sounds wild.
Yeah.
Just like tethering it to the ocean floor.
Yeah. Could you imagine the upscaled version?
I can't.
My question is, when they pound those tethered, like whatever they're anchoring it with, are they going to use the volcano hammerhead sharks?
Probably.
Yes.
Probably put lasers on them to like drill holes too.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's how they kind of like keep other fish away from that area, as they have those hammerhead sharks that are, I'm assuming, and I'm saying it right here, indestructible. They'll have them kind of be like a periphery force.
I ask for one simple thing here, people, and that's for sharks with freaking laser beams attached to their heads.
Well, you know what? Energy production isn't the only problem we have. There are tons of plastic waste everywhere. And unless we want the future of our planet to resemble Disney's Wall-E, we're going to have to figure out a way to deal with it. And that answer may lie in the gut microbiome in the larval stage of the Zoophobus morio beetle, which researchers have dubbed superworms. That's right, we're talking about worms again. Sorry, Steffi. I gave you energy for the first story. Now we're gonna do worms.
It's okay, I can take it. I can handle this.
Asterisk, not really worms.
It look like worms. Mm-hmm.
We'll get into it. Christian Rinke of the University of Queensland has reported that these larvae are capable of surviving on a diet of only polystyrene, which is hinting that something in their microbiome is capable of breaking down plastics. If we can figure out exactly what that is, it could help us get rid of all of this pesky plastic. So what do we think about superworms and the super microbiome that could help us with our plastic problem?
This actually reminded me a lot about the dermestid beetles that we've kept in my lab for a long time. Dermestid beetles are flesh-eating beetles, so we use them to break down the soft tissue around skeletal systems so that we can look at cool skeletons of animals that we've used or that we've recovered in various different ways, totally ethically and legally, mind you. So what reminded me of it, though, is that one of the things that we always have to do is keep styrofoam in the enclosure because they like to burrow into the styrofoam and lay their eggs. And so I've heard the crunching sound of beetle larvae going through styrofoam, polystyrene, and it's loud. It's crazy. But I worry about the animals here, right? I mean, I can sustain myself on a diet entirely made up of Twinkies, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be happy, and it doesn't mean that I'm going to be in a good mood, and it doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to, get out of my chair at the end of the day, and do something productive. And so I worry about what it might look like if we are training entire colonies of animals to sustain themselves on a product as unnatural as polystyrene.
The first couple of days of the all Twinkie diet would be okay, though. At least the first couple hours.
I don't know.
Couple hours. I'm not a huge Twinkie fan, so I'm assuming like the person who would sign up for this would be, though, and that's the eyes I'm viewing this through.
Well, would they? I mean, are these beetles self-selecting? I like to eat microplastics, so please use my larvae.
Nope.
Right.
Well, based on the like results after they move them off of their all plastic diet, I would assume that they weren't self-selecting because what we're not telling you, the article does, is they survived on an all-plastic diet. They did not thrive.
Right.
They actually did slightly better than the beetles who were starved.
I'm surprised they were able to eat it.
That's amazing.
And digest it and to get something of some sort of nutrient out of it. I mean, that is fascinating that we have created garbage that we can't even break down, but worms can.
Right. And I think this is the important point of this conversation, and that is that the intention is not to unleash these colonies of larvae, right? It's instead to harness the enzymes that they're producing that break it down, that break down these plastics, to use that in a larger scale sort of operation. And so on the one hand, it's much more romantic, maybe not for Steffi, to think about worms or larvae eating through all of our plastic in the ocean, right? I mean, back to the conversation we were just having about turbines inside the ocean. These turbines are being placed around the periphery of the giant Pacific trash island, plastic island. And so, and mind you, that's not really observable from satellite because we're not talking about big pieces of plastic. We're talking about tiny microplastics that are just concentrated in this area. And so if you could find an enzyme to break that down that is not detrimental to the rest of the ecosystem, that is a huge advancement, especially since, when we think about how much of our recycling is actually recycled, and it's so small.
Oh gosh, it's like 7% of plastic. It's so tiny.
So small. And even of the ones that like the recycling centers will take, right? If they'll take number 1 plastics or number 2 plastics or number 5, whatever it is, only ones that are in a particular shape that are going to then be resaleable, right, are the ones that are actually recycled. Everything else is just then moved to the landfill and ultimately ends up in our oceans. And so having an enzyme that could break this down would be huge.
I think so. I think you've hit the nail right on the head.
With a hammerhead shark?
I'm
so sorry, James.
It's okay. It's okay. I set it up. You hit it out of the park. Somebody else has to score occasionally.
That's right. James Reed with the assist.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm the Wayne Gretzky of the Science Night podcast.
Wait. I am the Wayne Gretzky here.
No, you know, a lot of us. I'm the Rangers Wayne Gretzky.
Okay.
You can be the Oilers Wayne Gretzky.
Right. I'd like to be the Blues Wayne Gretzky, just because like that was a really cool time. He did in the Blues history.
Did he play with the Blues?
He did.
Huh.
Is this hockey? And then there was baseball?
Yeah, we're talking about hockey, which uses plastic face shields.
Perfect.
Bring it back. I read this and I was thinking a lot of the cone snail article where we're kind of now very into, as a podcast, very into cone snails and the things that they can do for us. But I like the idea that we're seeing another thing that worms could do that doesn't necessarily require, or I should say, we're seeing another thing that an animal can do that doesn't necessarily require us to like throw 1,000 of these animals onto a garbage patch and have them just eat their way to zero garbage patch. But we can use something within them and then synthesize it, then do it. So we don't actually have to have a bunch of these superworms dying for service.
For our trash. I want to know the origin story of this study. Like, how did they discover that these worms were eating plastic? Like, that's amazing.
Maybe that's what we do. We do the Science Night follow-up and we send them a Twitter mention and hope for the best. It worked with Bea Ramiro. I'm just saying.
Okay, there you go.
Worked with Lee Berger, too.
Did work with Lee Berger.
Mm-hmm.
Just like Wayne Gretzky said, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take.
Right. Well done. Well done. He was the greatest for a reason, you know.
So I want to tell you something. I love science. I made a whole podcast about how much I love it.
What podcast is that?
Yeah.
History's B-Sides.
Oh, okay.
You should all go listen to it. Here's why I love science. In 2014, the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency launched the Hayabusa 2 mission with the goal of landing a probe on an asteroid, collecting material from its surface, shooting a capsule full of said material back to Earth, finding it in the Australian outback, and then analyzing the material. And guess what? It all worked. It just all worked. And because of it, we now have the oldest rocks ever studied on Earth, teaching us more about how our solar system was formed. This reading up on, the popular reporting on the actual rocks was interesting, but like reading about the mission itself was crazy. The likelihood of this working is so small, and the fact that it worked on Japan's second attempt at this is insane. How many Apollos did it take us to get to the moon?
Oh, gosh. I think the engineering that went into this is fascinating. It's amazing. And then they were able to bring back these meteorites that they're very unique because they didn't travel through the Earth's atmosphere and they weren't contaminated by our surface conditions. So they were pure, essentially. And we've never seen that before. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
I think you're not giving credit where credit is due here. I mean, we did have 2 Hollywood blockbusters that landed on asteroids that gave us the blueprint for how to do this, right?
And saved the world.
I think only Bruce Willis landed on an asteroid. Bruce Willis and his crew. I think Deep Impact
you may be right.
Was just...
It just blew it up.
I think it hit. No, I think it just hit.
Oh, I don't remember. Yeah, so it clearly wasn't...
That's the Deep Impact.
Fair. That's a fair point, actually. That's a fair point. Although Bruce Willis's movie was called Armageddon, and that didn't come to fruition, so...
We should follow this up later on to see what they actually find in these meteorites that we've never had access to before. So it'll take time to analyze this.
Yeah, we're in very early on this story, as we do. And we have much to learn still. It's just exciting that it's happened.
Yeah, that's true. I guess we should note that like the big thing that this article is reporting is that they got the rocks back and they were able to kind of like very briefly analyze and kind of see what they were. But now they're going, and they did it with like 2% of the sample, so they have lots left over. I think they're holding, at least the way I understood it, they're holding a fair amount of it on reserve so that as testing and sampling methods advance, they can then relook at these rather than having to send Hayabusa 3 up to this asteroid and hope it all works again. So I guess if we see anything else, you'll hear about it on the Science Night podcast. Coming up next, we have my conversation with Camryn Martin, host of the Nature is Gay podcast, who is going to tell you all about biology beyond the binary after this message from another podcast that I think you will enjoy.
Nature, we're part of it. Animals, we're one of them. What can we learn from other species? How can our lives be better by reconnecting with nature? And why does it matter at all? That's what Wild Connection, the podcast, is all about. Every week, we bring you authors, filmmakers, scientists, and conservationists whose work is revealing why being connected to nature and wildlife matters. You can find us where you get your podcasts, including iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. We're hosted by Podbean, so you can find us there too. And you can keep up with us on Twitter at WildConnectPod.
Welcome back to the Science Night podcast. We are talking to Camryn Martin, and I'm going to pull back the curtain a little bit on what it is to be a podcaster. This is right now the third time we're trying to do this interview because of something I like to call things going wrong. And it's all on my end. I'm not saying that our dear guest Camryn is at fault. I'm sure it's me some point. And if it's not, it's me projecting onto you at this point. But our guest tonight is the host of the Nature is Gay podcast, Camryn Martin. Camryn, again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me through all of these trials and tribulations.
Yeah, by this point we're best friends. We're we're starting a how to not do good at recording podcast. That's coming to the Wonderly app soon.
It's going to be very unhelpful because it's just going to be a lot of fumbling around. Like, did that work?
Maybe we do we do like a true crime podcast, but figuring out how we can be bad at recording audio.
That's how we'll soar to the top of the charts.
Yeah. Oh, that could be it. The first shitty audio prestige podcast. That could be our niche right there. That's a t-shirt. So anyway, Camryn, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do?
So, like you mentioned, I host a podcast called Nature is Gay, but in my real world job, I am a teaching assistant in a therapeutic farm school setting. So it's a really, really cool position that allows me to work with lots of different species. So I get to work with camels and llamas and alpacas. I also get to work with several birds of prey and sheep and horses. And we just got a porcupine. Sometimes I work in the garden with the plants. Like, I get a lot of exposure there, and it's been a really, really cool experience.
Talk to me a little bit about what a therapeutic farm is, because most of my time on a farm was the opposite of therapeutic, as I was stacking hay bales up for extra money in the summer.
Well, we do a lot of stacking of hay bales, not necessarily with the students. So it's a program for students can either be residential or day students, but they get recommended there from their school district. And it's for students who maybe like neurodiverse or have different diagnoses, but for whatever reason, they don't do well in like a traditional school setting. So then they get recommended to our facility, and the therapeutic part comes in when they have a job that they might have to do on the farm, or they are just feeling stressed that day and they can come hang out with one of the animals. They have classes in all of the areas. So they have horsemanship, wildlife, and the livestock farm science classes. And so I get to teach those classes if like one of the teachers is out, and I get to assist with those classes. So it's just kind of a really nice, like, open environment. The kids do their social work sessions there sometimes. It's a really interesting thing that I really wish that I had when I was a kid. Sure. The ability to just go visit a farm when I'm just feeling bummed out,
Yeah.
Cool.
I really do love that in certain instances, the American education system still has some room for improvement. But there are people and groups and areas that are trying new and interesting ways to get to people who just don't thrive in the traditional classroom setting. It seemed like when I was growing up in the 90s, the best we had was Try Harder. What? Have you tried Harder?
Yeah. Why don't you just focus or like try applying yourself?
Yeah. Or Sit in the Corner. That was a fun one when I was in the...
Yeah, it's like the things that I did get out of school, I know that a lot of my peers didn't, but now they've got different organizations. Like there's the Institute for Human Animal Interactions, and that's one that is really like promoting this positive animal human interaction aspect, especially in, you know, schools, but in other ways too. There's a lot of those kind of organizations that are promoting this idea of, and there's research to back it up too. I remember reading that kids who have ADHD, when they have interactions with animals, their focus is so improved and for a longer time than had they gotten physical activity. There's a lot of research to back it up, and there are a lot of organizations who are trying to promote that idea. So I don't know, hopefully we continue that into just the regular public school system, because I think that everybody has a little bit to benefit out of that.
If, you know, we come away by showing that these kind of alternatives to standard classroom models are there and available and less kind of like stigmatized, I think that's a good thing too. I don't have a good transition from your work with kids and farm animals to your work as a podcaster. So we're going to do one of those really fun, jarring transitions.
All right.
Because you are a podcaster as well, just like me, except, you know, asterisks next to my more recent podcasteries. But you're the host of the Nature is Gay podcast, and I absolutely love it. I am a subscriber, and all of you should do that as soon as this interview is over. Go over and click the follow, subscribe, whatever it is. Also rate and review, and do it to us too. But I love this podcast because you are kind of shining a light on the fact that there is evidence of homosexuality, mating patterns outside of the standard binary that humans kind of think is the natural order. Well, some humans think is the natural order. And you're just kind of highlighting that the natural order is the opposite. There are different ways to think about sexuality and mating habits in non-human species. And I think that's a really interesting take on this. So what brought you to decide you wanted to do this podcast?
In addition to the job that I do now, I have a background in doing wildlife research, and I've always really loved watching, you know, animal shows. I just saw something on Instagram about how it's been 20 years since Zaboomafoo ended. I used to love Zaboomafoo. I met Martin Kratt one time, and it was like the highlight of my young life. And I always really looked up to these like science communicators like Steve Irwin and the Kratt brothers. And as in my role as like teaching assistant, was recently doing some research for Pride Month into homosexuality in animals, just thinking like maybe I could turn it into a lesson plan or turn it into a like bulletin board, something along those lines. And read this fact that 10% of all domesticated rams exhibit exclusive homosexual behavior. And it blew my mind. I could not stop talking about it. I could not stop sharing it with people. I was like, did you know that 10% of them are gay, like exclusively gay? And it's not to do with the way they were raised. It's not got to do with any controllable external factors. It's just hardwired into them. And it doesn't matter if there's a female who is in estrus and ready to go, like they are going to just mate with other males. And so I was like, well, I think this stuff is really interesting. I want to find some sort of an Instagram page or a podcast, something that covers a lot more of these topics, because I want to learn more. And I couldn't find it. I couldn't find that platform or that base, that community for discussing these things. And I just decided, well, I kind of have some science communication experience. I guess I'll be that person. And it just kind of started from there.
I absolutely love that story. It's now the third time I've heard it, but I love it. I love it just as much this time because the way that you link the science communicators of your past and how important they were to you, and just deciding, you know, I can do this. No one is talking about this. I feel like somebody should talk about this. I'm going to go out and do it. I think more scientists or people involved with science or just have a background in science education should feel more comfortable in doing this. I'm not saying that everybody that wears a lab coat occasionally needs to get a podcast. That would flood the market way too much, and I just can't handle that hit to my analytics. But I feel like if you see a niche that you think needs to be filled, you should all feel comfortable in doing that. And I'm so happy you're doing that, because I have learned a lot from listening to this podcast. And we're not gonna break down every episode. Maybe that can be like the second podcast you start, is breaking further down each episode, like a director's cut or something. But what are I don't want to say strange things, because I don't want to make any of this seem like it's strange. What are some of the more interesting things that you learned about from this series and in researching these series?
I think for me, so I kind of try to avoid anthropomorphizing anything that I'm talking about, but it's hard because I am kind of viewing it through this lens of, there's no binary in like human sex and sexuality, and there's no binary in the natural world, sex and sexuality. There's no really difference there, but sometimes it's kind of unavoidable to anthropomorphize. Anyway, one of the things that I uncovered in the episode about stump-tailed macaques is that not only was it really interesting to read these papers about the very, very specific mating patterns of stump-tailed macaques, like what their sex positions looked like, how long their sexual acts lasted, how many thrusts there were during their sexual acts. But between male stump-tailed macaques, when two males mate and then they finish copulating, they will eat the semen of the macaque that's on top, essentially. It felt so human. It was weird to read that. I was like, that's something that, because it has no reproductive reasoning. I can't imagine any kind of like sociosexual reasoning behind that. Perhaps it's because, well, there's nutrition in it. We don't want to waste it, but it just felt so human. It was so interesting to read that. And then the most recent one at this point, the hyena episode, that hyenas have a pseudopenis, which they won't know this, but you and I talked about what is the plural of penis. And I looked it up, and it's peenies or penises.
That's fun.
Yeah,
that's more whimsical than I was expecting.
Peenies. But yeah, so female hyenas have a pseudopenis that in appearance is very difficult to differentiate from the male's erect penis. For a very long time, observers thought that they were hermaphrodites because they just couldn't tell the difference between the two. But because of this pseudopenis, it has a lot of important functions, but it also is very detrimental to their survival as a species, because the females, the rate of birth when they're giving their first birth, I think it's as high as like 15%. And then I want to say like 60% of firstborn cubs die. So 15% of mothers die in their first birth, and then 60% of firstborn cubs die, which is insane that this has evolved, and it is still working for them, but it does come with these pretty steep consequences for them.
Yeah, in listening to that, I was really trying to put my experimental biology cap on and think about what benefit was that selected for? Or was it just outside of the evolutionary factors, and it just happened to evolve with whatever suite of things that were beneficial? You know what I mean? Like, because hyenas are pretty bulletproof when it comes to a lot of things. They can kind of eat anything. They're good hunters. They can move around really well. They have a social structure, so there's kind of like that benefit of having numbers, but that it just seems like the thing that creates new hyenas is really difficult. You talked about like the training sessions that males have to go through before they can even kind of figure out how to mate with a female. And it's just really interesting, like why did that evolve? I'm not asking you. I'm unless you have an answer.
I don't. I mean,
yeah.
That's one thing about evolution is it doesn't have to have a reasoning. That's
Right.
something I'm always having to remind myself. Just because it evolved this way doesn't mean that it has to have evolved for a specific reason. It just wasn't detrimental, so it didn't breed out of the population. I mean, the pseudopenis does serve as kind of a communication sign for when they're greeting each other.
Mhm.
An erect like penis or pseudopenis is a sign of deference or submission. So if you're like submitting to the dominant female, or if you are fighting with another hyena and you are ready to submit and be done with the fight, then you can have an erection. But aside from those reasonings, I don't know what other function it would serve. And I don't think that scientists really understand the evolutionary history of it, or where or why this could have evolved. I don't remember reading anything about that in my research. So it's kind of a mystery.
And it's really interesting that you're shedding any light on hyenas, because I think, you cover in the episode too. This is now just becoming the director's cut of the Spotted Hyena podcast. But you point out, like, they're really misunderstood. They're feliform, so they're more closely related to cats than dogs, but everyone just kind of assumes they're dogs. Whenever there's anthropomorphized savanna animals, they're always the bad guy. You're never going to see the good guy hyena, unless Disney's really changed up the Lion King extended universe, and I haven't checked in since Lion King 2. And there is like the cultural kind of stigmatization with groups in that area, a large area of Africa, where they're just not always the good guys. So it's really interesting that we're learning all these things about hyenas, because I think maybe that's one of the reasons that they're not well studied, is just, it's like, oh, they're hyenas, they're everywhere. Why would we study these things? I don't know.
Maybe that's my next project. I did go to 2 years of film school, so maybe the next thing is a movie where the hyena is the protagonist.
I think you just do a rip-off version of the Lion King, but have it be hyenas.
Exactly. Reverse the roles, and really the lion is the bad guy.
Yeah.
They steal all the hyena's food.
They did. They did steal all the hyena's food. That was crazy when I learned that too, because you always learn about like the lioness is actually the good hunter, but then it's like, yeah, but they're also just not that great at hunting. They just kind of hang out with hyenas. See, the Animal Planet documentaries made me think it was the opposite, that the hyena is going to swoop in and steal the food.
Right, yeah. But I think it was like 35% of the time it's no, I can't remember the statistic. It's been too long.
Yeah.
Never mind.
It was a significant amount of time where the hyena is actually the hunter.
Hunter, and the lion is just kind of opportunistically sharing the meal with the hyena.
Mm-hmm. And actually, let's use this as a springboard to talk about the ways that you're also kind of de-anthropomorphizing some of the Disney movies too, because I'm not trying to say that you are picking on Disney every time you do one of your podcast episodes, but 2 of the 8 released podcasts do talk about how Disney kind of got things wrong a little bit. So let's talk about clownfish for a second, and about hermaphrodism in clownfish, and why Finding Nemo should have been very different.
Yeah, I will pick on Disney whenever given an opportunity.
That's fine.
So maybe now that you've pointed that out, that might just be some subconscious bias.
Just steer into it. Make it a conscious bias now.
But yeah, so clownfish are hermaphroditic, all species of clownfish. So they don't all look like the ones you see in pet stores, the black and white and orange ones. But all species are hermaphroditic, and that means that essentially they have a social hierarchy where there is a top male and female who are the largest in the group, and then underneath are all males. So all clownfish are born male. And when the dominant female dies, the dominant male will change sexes and become the most dominant female, and the other clownfish will move up in the hierarchy. And that's because it's a lot more energy intensive to produce eggs than it is to produce sperm. So having a very large fecund female makes a lot of sense because she can produce all the eggs, and then the smaller males don't have to expend a lot of energy to fertilize them, creating sperm.
Mhm.
But I mean, if you think about Finding Nemo, that means that when in the beginning of the movie, Nemo's mom Coral dies, then Marlin, his dad, unless there's some other clownfish in their group that we don't know about, Marlin would have become the female of the group, and Nemo would have moved up in the hierarchy and become Marlin's mate. I'm not like ragging on Disney for not including that in the movie for obvious reasons, but
Very
it's
different
just,
story.
it's an interesting way to think about it. It's an interesting take on that dynamic. It would make it interesting.
Yeah, maybe they'll get that in like 3, in the third one. There's 2 now, right? Maybe they'll do that, and maybe that'll be Finding Nemo 3.
Yeah, where Nemo becomes the female of the group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when Marlin dies, and he's like, well, also there's no other clownfish in that universe, so
No.
This is just an evolutionary dead end all over the place.
Exactly. He would just be a lonely little clownfish wandering around.
Yeah, but with a lot of heart.
Yes.
And one
A lot of
small.
spunk. Yes, and one small fish.
Oh, man. Wonderful stuff. So I also want to talk about what are some of the below the surface goals you have for this podcast, rather than just being a podcast that shows off really cool stuff. What are some of the things that you're trying to communicate as like the larger takeaway points with this podcast?
I guess in my mind, first off, I'm really bad at setting goals, but I think what I'm kind of imagining is to have a space where people who are interested in these topics, but also people within like the LGBTQ community can come together and discuss these things without any sort of judgment and just normalize it and discuss these ideas and share them, because that is really the heart of why I started this podcast, is that these things that really, really interest me, I love sharing them with people. And when people enjoy them, I get so much out of that and that sharing of information. And that's kind of what I want to build, is this community and this community feeling of being able to talk about these things.
I really do think that is great. And, you know, one of the things that a lot of people don't learn about in biology is like a lot of stuff, at least in high school, is a lot of the stuff that has to do with biology, which is sex and death, because we get a little squeamish when we talk about those things, but that is all of evolution.
I think, too, a lot of these topics are very complex, and people tend to shy away from complex issues, especially when they relate to sex. With the episode that is coming out today, it will be out when this episode is published, but it's about plants and it's about tomatoes. And I remember learning about plants in college, and it was very straightforward and very simplistic.
Mm-hmm.
And once I started digging into it, it is complex. Sex determination in plants there is a lot of information out there, and there are so many different ways and types and reasons and hows and whys. And that's part of it too, is that these are complex issues that people just don't want to touch. And I don't want to shy away from that.
I would love to yes and you like I did with the clownfish and the hyenas, but I know that I grow plants, and and I think I got the same series of like 2 to 3 lectures about plants when I was taking my last biology class too. We acknowledged that they existed and that they had chlorophyll instead of mitochondria and cell walls. And now I'm getting towards the end of what I know about plant biology. So I am super excited to listen to this podcast. I know what I'll be doing tomorrow.
Yeah, it's like the one complex thing you learn is, oh, well, not all berries are berries. And that's kind of the end.
Again, after this podcast is over, go learn about sex and tomatoes. There, I give you a free title. You can just take that one. I think what I really love is you talked about building a community, and I could see somebody who is really questioning everything about themselves, especially young people who just don't have a lot of resources if they're questioning their sexuality, if they're questioning their gender identity, anything along that journey. Just having any point of contact to kind of show you that This is the natural state. The thing that you are experiencing is the natural state in all of these species, and humanity is included with that. We as a species like to put ourselves above everything. We like to think of ourselves as the apex of all evolution rather than a portion of it. I love that your podcast is breaking down some of those walls.
Yeah, I definitely think that, like I said, I don't want to shy too much away from anthropomorphizing the things that we talk about, because I don't want to remove us from nature, right? I want that to get in there and be sticky and like complicated, because we are part of it. And if you are questioning who you are or trying to figure out who you are, what you want to be, like, you are nature experiencing itself. You know, you are part of this story, and there is no normal, and there is no like black and white, like there's no binary. That's why, you know, I say the podcast goes beyond the binary, because the binary doesn't exist.
Instead of anthropomorphizing nature, we are putting nature and the natural cycles back into humanity. And I think if you can achieve that goal, man, will we be better off because of it. The last thing I'm going to ask you for the third time is, how can we follow you? How can we keep up with the things that you're doing?
So the podcast is on most major podcasting platforms. So you can find it on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Google, Amazon, Pocket Casts. But we are also on Instagram at Nature is Gay Pod. And right now, that's all the social media that we have.
It is a great show. Go out and listen to it. You're at the end of this episode, so you might as well just go right over the Nature is Gay, follow, rate it, review it, and listen to a bunch of episodes. Thank you so much, Camryn, for all the times that you've talked to me. We've now made it to the end of this podcast.
It's been fun every time. Thank you for having me.
Great. I don't think there's going to be a fourth one if I forget to save now. So I'm going to click save, and we're going to send you back to me. Thank you so much to Camryn for putting up with all the technical issues so that we could do this interview. It was challenging, to say the least. Be sure to subscribe to the Nature is Gay podcast and follow them on all of their social media. Well, you have come again to the end of another episode of the Science Night podcast, but we have lots more coming your way all summer. So be sure to follow us on social media. And if you want to follow me, I am at James_Reed3. I'm going to be honest, it's a lot of real bad Phillies tweets right now, but we can all get through this summer of my discontent together. Steffi, where can everybody follow you?
You can follow me on Twitter at SteffiDeem and Instagram at Starshippin'.
Jason, where can people find what you're talking about?
You can find me on Twitter at OregonJM. I promise not to tweet about the Royals anymore this summer. I mean, I just read yesterday that if the Royals, who are the worst team in baseball, scored exactly 5 runs in every single one of their games, they would still be the 15th worst team in baseball. So I'm going to stop talking about them.
For the best. Baseball's a disease, folks. I'm just telling you right now.
I'm just going to talk about dogs and traveling.
Follow Steffi.
And science. Sorry, no baseball.
We'll retweet Steffi.
Maybe the sausage race from the Brewers
and Steffi
game.
Cakes. What about Steffi Cakes? You should talk more about them.
Yeah.
So follow Steffi to find out what that's all about.
Yeah, send them to me.
You can follow the podcast at Science Night 1 and be sure to visit our home on the web at scinight.com for links to all our other social media, past episodes, links to the stories that we talk about, and of course, our merch, including our sticker packs. Everything you need to support the show is in one convenient location, and it's at scinight.com. We will be back in 2 weeks with another episode, and until then, have a great night. The Science Night podcast is a proud member of the Riverpower Podcast Mill. To find out more about our shows, go to riverpower.xyz. We're just going to start it again.
All right. They just have to deal with it.
Yeah.